Well, hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and start with the word of prayer, and then we'll get going from there. Dear Lord, thank you for your goodness and for your faithfulness. Thank you so much for this night and the chance to talk about some things in an attempt to learn deeper truths about the world and reality, and therefore about you. And I pray that you bless it and help me to not say anything patently untrue, and guide us all into a greater understanding of this world that you've made and the mystery of our relationship to you. And so, pray all these things in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Okay, so first of all, I don't normally, give talks or lecture as much as I can help it. It's bad pedagogy. And there's few enough of us in here. I wouldn't mind terribly just getting all your names, which I'll remember maybe two of them, just to, kind of create a little more of an interactional feel. And then feel free, I'm going to be kind of delving into some, difficult things for me. Maybe they'll be clear to you. We'll have a good chunk of time for questions at the end, but feel free to break in and wait, okay, I did not understand what you just said, within reason, because I can only do so much. So, all right, now you're Tricia, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and that's the only, and I know Megan because she's my wife. I know Chris. Oh, and gosh, now I have a limit of 3.
Chris.
Oh, see, that's why. That's what I believe in. Okay, now, but everybody else, do you mind introducing yourselves?
I'm Eric.
Eric.
Bob.
And I didn't say it right, but it's okay.
Phyllis.
Phyllis.
I'm Gil.
Gil.
I'm Elliot.
Elliot. Perfect. I'm going to basically start by quoting you here in a second. So the metaphysics of presence. Obviously, this has to do with the way, you've seen the movies where Santa is able to dematerialize his physical stature and get down the other kind of presence, the metaphysics of presence. And throughout Western philosophy and literature, it's a problem. So we're going to start there. But what I noticed when I walked in, without really intending to, with this painting and the artist's statement over here, it's incredibly pertinent. I'll read. It's called Necessity and Possibility. Right? And in this third paragraph here, it says, in this painting, I've taken up the idea of man's inward experience of necessity and possibility. Briefly put, necessity refers to the earthly, time-bound, bodily finite constraints of man's existence and experience of himself and the world. Man lives under the weight of necessities he cannot control, evade, or escape. Possibility, on the other hand, refers to the mind and spirituality, and spiritually driven imagination all humans possess. Man can, in the freedom of his mind, reach for the stars. He can imagine the, quote, possible, in contrast to all the boundaries and limitations of human experience. As the modern artist Paul Klee put it, the ideological capacity of man to penetrate earthly and supernatural spaces at random, in contrast to his physical prostration, implies the whole discord of experience. Half-winged, half-imprisoned, that is man. And what I'm going to kind of get around to is that, frankly, I think our Christian faith, for those of us who have it, says something opposite of that. That our earthbound, finite, physical beings are not somehow lesser than some idea of a spiritual, abstract one. So first, for some quotes. This morning I was teaching Shakespeare, Twelfth Night. There's a little interchange in Act 3, Scene 1 between Viola, who's actually dressed as a man, Cesario, because she got shipwrecked and has to protect herself and get a job, etc., and the fool, Feste, Viola. And this is the beginning of the whole act. Viola. Save thee, friend, and thy music. Dost thou live by thy labor? And that means, do you make your living? by your, sorry, I meant to say tabor, which is his instrument that he's playing. Do you live by your tabor? The fool. No, sir. I live by the church. Viola. Art thou a churchman? No such matter, sir. I do live by the church, for I do live at my house, and my house doth stand by the church. Viola. So thou mayest say the king lies by a beggar, if a beggar dwell near him, or the church stands by thy tabor, if thy tabor stand by the church. The fool. You have said, sir, or you said it, because it's kind of blasphemous. You have said, sir, to see this age, a sentence is but a cheverel glove to a good wit. How quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. Viola. Nay, that's certain. They that dally nicely with words may quickly make them wanton. Fool. I would, therefore, my sister had had no name, sir. Why, man? Why, sir, her name's a word, and to dally with that word might make my sister wanton. And it goes on, and they kind of argue back and forth. He says, these days, as if it's a new thing, and to some degree in Elizabethan England, language was changing even more rapidly than it normally does. He says, these days, a sentence is like a kid skin or a goat skin glove. You can just flip it around to mean whatever you want. And if you have a wit, she says, you can make words wanton or do whatever you want. Let's read some Hemingway. Look at this large stack of books. It's just kind of a prop. We'll probably only use 4 or 5 of them. Sun Also Rises. We're going to start at the end, but this whole book concerns the same problem. So, who's read The Sun Also Rises? Oh, it's a great book. Well, I think it's a great book. And the 2 main characters are Jake Barnes and then his love interest, the lady Brett Ashley. And you notice throughout, she's often saying, don't talk about it. Talk is all rot. That's one of her phrases she uses a lot. At the very end, there's not really a climax in the traditional sense that many people look for. But Brett makes a very small move towards goodness. She says, well, this is Brett, it makes one feel rather good deciding not to be a bitch. Jake. Yes. It's sort of what we have instead of God. Some people have God, I said, quite a lot. Earlier she says, I just talk around it. I don't talk about it. And Jake answers, you'll lose it if you talk about it. Okay? So I'm beginning to just set up the problem here. I'm going to read just one more passage from Augustine of what I called I think in the abstract that I wrote, the unreliability of words for being containers that we could use for anything really meaningful. Here's Augustine. And this is from Confessions. The first book starts with, great are you. Should I start by praising you or calling upon you? But how can I call upon you unless I know what you're like already? Because I might call upon something different. But how can I know unless somebody preaches to me? This paradox of how can I understand without calling on you? But how could I call on you unless I already understood what you are? But he says, you've put in our hearts. You've made us restless until we rest in thee. And then the second chapter, they're this long. And how shall I call upon my God and my Lord? For when I call on him, I ask him to come into me. And what place is there in me into which my God can come? Into which God can come, even he who made heaven and earth. Is there anything in me, O Lord my God, that can contain you? Do indeed the very heaven and earth which you have made and in which you have made me contain you? Or, as nothing could exist without you, does whatever exists contain you? Why then do I ask you to come into me? Since I indeed exist, and could not exist if you were not in me, because I am not yet in hell, though you are even there. For, quote, if I go down into hell, you are there. It's from the Psalms. I could not therefore exist, could not exist at all, O my God, unless you were in me. Or should I not rather say that I could not exist unless I were in you, from whom are all things, by whom are all things, in whom are all things? Even so, Lord, even so. Where do I call you to, since you are in me? Or whence can you come into me? For where outside heaven and earth can I go, that from thence my God may come into me, who has said, quote, I fill heaven and earth. So what's the problem? There's a couple immediate problems that come to mind. So the first is going to be the basic subject object dichotomy. And the second, which we're going to look at more elaborately, is the idea of referentiality. Okay. Subject-object dichotomy. Who's heard of that? Anyone want to? Okay. It's not a common name, and I forget. Gil. All right. Give us a take. What's, I didn't realize. This was like a game show. I would have made use of this sooner. That's right. Gil, subject-object. And, just give it whatever you got. I mean, put you on the spot here.
Yeah, so the subject-object dichotomy is the idea that subjects are consciousnesses, their vantage points or something like that. Objects have sort of permanence, so there's this relationship that I as a subject have to the objects around me.
Uh-huh. Keep going, I'm just drawing.
And like the clarity of what that relationship is and how much of the objective world that I can know seems to be a persistent problem in philosophy.
That's great. Yeah, that's beautiful. And so it can be taken specifically, which you did a really good job, not even being a plant, that was great, of getting at some of the specific philosophical problems that the subject is the observing I, the letter I as well as, and everything else or any entity out there is the object perhaps. But there's simply also the simple idea of between any two entities, no matter how close, and think of your own just personal relationships. In fact, sometimes the closer you get, the more you're aware of this. There's an unbridgeable chasm in one sense, because each human or each entity is a universe unto ourselves. I can't read your minds, can't read mine, and as I said, often the closer you get, the more that stands out, because you are closer in so many ways. You both feel that you're in each other's minds, but also feel as if there's this, incommensurability of communication. So anyway, the subject-object dichotomy, that's something that throughout literature, and specifically of the 20th century we're going to look at, comes to the fore. But then, secondly, language. And this is where we'll kind of delve deep into the philosophical problem, and then get a chance to read a little more of literature. So what, our modern legacy, where we are right now, 2019, why do I say that, there's this, throughout the 20th century, this lack of, or this loss of faith in the reliability of referentiality? The foil here, or the thing that I'm saying has fallen by the wayside, or did, 100 years ago approximately, is logocentrism, which you know what it says. And that's the idea that, more or less, words, or perhaps concepts, glom onto something out there in the world. I say chair, you know what I mean? There's a chair. But even in this room, even in very similar chairs, it's really clear that, oh, wait a second, okay, so you're saying that this is the same as this? Now, I don't mean it's literally the same, identical. Is it another instance of this? Well, even if they were, even these two, there's infinite difference between them. I mean, obviously they aren't comprised of the same molecules, but they're also completely different. And this one looks different. And if you were to get a rolling chair in here, well, okay, what's a chair? Well, it's something to sit on. Oh, okay. So when I go and sit on the piano keys, does the piano transform into a chair? Oh, there's a piano behind the camera there. Does the piano transform into a chair? No. I mean, yes, you could say. Well, you could say that really realistically. For example, if if I was one of my children and the piano was our piano at home and the boy's mother saw one of them sitting on the piano keys, she might say, "What are you doing? That's not your chair." But why would she even say that? Because literally you're using it as a chair. But how far afield can you go with that? If I have a hoverboard that I sit on, is it a chair? What I'm getting at is this is potentially problematic. The really easy, oh, here's a word, and here's a thing out there in the world, or even a concept, that it always and only connects to. But beyond that, in the early 20th century, to get to a more technical falling away from this, we start with structuralism. And we'll put down Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure. I don't speak French, but I might even misspell his name, but it's basically like that. As the representative. And here's the insight of structuralism that's very valuable, okay? And I ended up talking to my Shakespeare class about this morning. I'm going to draw a little while I talk. We use the example, it's the first one that came to mind, but I think it's apt, of what's the definition of the word the, right? Now, as a linguist by training in my undergraduate degree and a lover of syntax, I understand that there's a difference between definition and the function. But if you were to say, okay, does the word the have meaning? Well, I don't know. Does it? That's an open question. You think the word has meaning? You can say something. Chris is nodding.
Sure.
Oh yeah, I forgot microphone.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know this. This is so you guys know this.
And I'm listening.
It does have meaning. I would say I'm particularly sensible to the fact that the meaning of the definite article can vary depending on its context. While teaching ancient Greek, say,
Sure.
Where the definite article has a larger possible field of meaning.
Yeah, you can substitute it as you could just say ha instead of the noun that it
Right.
specifies.
Sometimes it's even a relative pronoun, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it does, but its meaning varies depending upon its context. I guess that's what I'd say.
That's true. I mean, it can function like our he, for example, if I'm not correct. It's been a while.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, take the English word the, which can't, or it doesn't. That's the next step.
So
but even there,
in English
yeah.
too, I would say that the meaning of the depends depending on its context. So, for instance, referring to saying the chair is different than saying the chair. For instance, can be pronounced differently, can be used to emphasize something, say.
Yeah, and that's actually very interesting.
Also, in English in particular, the is almost like a prefix, right? It requires something to come after it. But when combined with these things, it does have meaning and has a limited field of meaning.
Yeah, and by meaning, Yeah, meaning's kind of interesting with a word like this, right? What do we mean by meaning? When you normally think of that, you think of some sort of content, right? And the doesn't have a lot of that, if anything. Again, this is just one example. But you said it has to go with something else, and that's a good point. So it operates functionally, which that's really important for what I'm about to do with these, or talk about with these dots and lines. But even, you said it has a limited field of meaning, and I know what you're saying. What I'm getting at is, okay, we sense this, like, oh, I guess, like, okay, what does the mean? It can mean quite a few things, but we understand them all, if you're, a competent or native speaker of English. But you can also, I would say, it is limited, but it's also infinite, because it's generative. And where I'm going with that is, so for example, we could come up, and I don't mean like, oh, okay, in this room, amongst these people, the is code for cat. That's not what I mean. That's just substitute, it's just a code. So, oh look, there's the. That's just simple vocabulary or but that's not what I mean. We could also do it like this. So you said, that was really interesting, you said, the chair. Wait, are you talking about the chair, or are you talking about the chair? What does one mean when one says the chair? We all kind of know. What is it that we mean?
It's the most important chair.
It's the preeminent chair. It's the Platonic chair up there in the sky. Yeah. And I think, and you could even do it, I mean, language is so generative. What I mean by that is that it's not fixed. It's productive, infinitely, so that I could, in 2 seconds from now, create a sentence that nobody in here has ever heard and that would never be reproduced again in the history of the world, probably. I guess it's being videoed. So, anyway, but you know what I mean. Like, we could do it right now. If you haven't thought about that, think about it. Of course, it always involves pink elephants, so those have probably all been used, right? So, since you mentioned snakes, the purple anaconda shivered in front of the lights before his photo shoot. Now, did anyone not understand the sentence? Now, it's fantastical. Probably, there's only been a few anacondas that have ever had photo shoots, but you understood. You pictured it, you understood it. Is that because you would already have ever had that thought in your head? I hope not. Right, so language is generative. Even something like we could, without this code switching or like substitution bit, we could make it stand alone. Like if we'd had this conversation even, we could say, are we talking the or the? Now, there's a lot of linguistic pragmatics that go into that because there's some facial expressions and pronunciation. But those two words mean two different things. Do we mean the or the? You know what I mean? Because we've already had this conversation. And there's other ways that could happen. Okay, leaving that aside. So how is it then that, in what way are words fixed? Or in what ways, you said, has a limited, potential scope? Come on in. How is that possible? And I do believe that. And that's why, I love, welcome. That's why, I'm about to read some Ash Wednesday, probably, the poem. So this is perfect. This is why I love language and literature, because I love science, I love physics, I love things that are not concrete necessarily, but scientific or something on the one hand, but then language kind of eludes pure science, but it is not, as we've just demonstrated, this willy-nilly. I've never met most of you in here, and you knew my sentence about the anaconda, for example, and it's not because we've thought those thoughts. Right. So, on to structuralism, which was the huge movement in philosophy, in the Western world, from the early 1900s through about 1955. Well, it was at its peak around then, even as Derrida and deconstruction came in. And here's the gist. Structuralism says something along the lines of anything in a system, like language, and language is the preeminent structure by which we understand other structures like anthropology or something like that. Anything in a structure, each element only means what it means or what have you by virtue of its relation in a pattern to the other ones. So language or words mean what they mean in a lot of ways because they don't mean the other things, but not in the sense of simply like there's some fixed puzzle and there's a finite number of pieces, but that you only understand what the word the or the means in relation to the system of which it's part, right? And so from there, in all the social sciences, for example, structuralism came to the fore. And so, if we're going to understand literature, we've got to understand it in terms of these archetypes. And, here's these patterns and stories. So, now let's look for those in all stories. And maybe we can even understand or judge stories by the way that they do or don't, or they might depart from the archetypal patterns, right? Similarly, ethnography looked for patterns in cultures, things like that. Sapir-Whorf, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, I don't know if you're familiar with that, was the idea, and kind of taking this to the extreme in a lot of ways, that you can only understand, or somebody can only understand a concept, or can only understand a concept if it's included in your native language. So there's the classic examples of Eskimos have 17 words for snow or something like that. And certain cultures only have basically 2 words for color, light and dark, and then other cultures have all sorts of nuances in between shades that we don't differentiate with. And so we don't have that concept. And that, just kind of, at least to me, and not only is it debunked more or less in the sciences, but to me, doesn't ring true, right? Because I could describe it. I just said there's shades in between, and you're visualizing mauve and what I don't know, some like little chopped up. It's exactly what Gill was visualizing, was lilac, whatever. Anyway, you know what I mean. That doesn't ring true, but that's kind of an offshoot of structuralism. Well, into that world came Derrida. Let's write his name down, Jacques Derrida. Now, Derrida is one of those figures like, Nietzsche, right? That people, know 2 sentences of and have a strong opinion about, right? And I might be that person too. But meaning, maybe the stereotype of Derrida is, he was an atheist. Well, actually, not so strongly as one would think. He's obfuscatory. He's not very clear. He's complex, but everything I've ever read, he seems to have an almost ruthless commitment to absolute precision of thought, and so it can be dense. But anyway, so he came along and literally at a conference at Johns Hopkins University in, I think, 1955, I believe, or 58, read a paper that was later published that stirred up the philosophical community. Side note, but that just doesn't seem to happen much anymore. I don't. Obviously, at conferences, for those of you who have been to them, they seem like kind of an exercise in futility often. But I mean, just in general, in how ideas spread. It's a side note, but how do? But we're going to be getting there by the end. How does the average individual, if there's such a being, how do they form their ideas? Certainly not by listening to dense philosophical papers given at Johns Hopkins, right? But Derrida, from that moment on, and with publication of Grammatology and many of his other works, shook up structuralism, even as it was approaching the zenith of its popularity in America, and it has shaped all the humanities since. And here's what he said. So the insight of the structuralists was that, was structurality. Namely, you can't understand a thing outside of its context, outside of the pattern in which it finds its place, whatever. But what Derrida put forward was that the blind spot there is that structurality itself must have structure. Must be pre-informed with structure to be coherent. Or, another way to put it is, every system of structuralism has always needed to posit, I'll just pick one, but makes sense, posit a still unmoving center to the structure by which everything else is able to be oriented. Does that make sense? Because if you think about it, if this is only what it is by relation of being at this, and this is just a visual, whatever, at this angle to this and in this pattern, well, it's kind of like the universe, like which way is up, And so if there isn't any word that means anything inherently, then how do all these words somehow spring into meaningfulness, right? As Camus said something along the lines. This might be a quote, but relatively, without an infinite reference point, life has no meaning. And that's a quote from somebody a missionary we grew up with, Albert Camus. And that's kind of a cosmic way to put it. But just technically, if you're saying things only mean what they mean because they're part of a structure, well, that structure has to have some stasis or that doesn't work. And so that was the beginning of deconstruction. And from there, what it doesn't result in, and we'll kind of move on from the technical here in a second, what it doesn't result in is just whatever you think is what something means. Derrida says that. But what it does make you look at closely, and the deconstructive method, is to look into the structure of a system or the pattern of ideas within some system and find the inherent contradictions that belie the apparent coherence that system would attempt to put forth. And that's the deconstructive method. So I don't want to try to just think up an example, but perhaps, but I might. Let's just take Christianity. There you go. If you were to deconstruct the discourse around Christianity, all the words surrounding it, you might look at, well, this is said, but then the very nature of the power structures in which it has to be said, or the beliefs that it entails in order to be said, to make sense, undermine the very meaning that it purports to have, or something like that. Again, I shouldn't think of examples that I didn't think of ahead of time, but that's the deconstruction method. Okay, so that's, the first question is, and each part, this isn't a sermon, but it's always like when the pastor's like, okay, that's my first point. They won't be this long. That's the problem, right? That has always been there. I mean, Augustine's talking about how, so I left this aside, but the subject-object dichotomy, that holds for language too. Referent and or sign and signified. Sign being, here's these noises I make with my throat. Signified is purportedly this idea I have in my head. Well, all of these movements crush that, the reliability of that. Similarly, not only, as Augustine says, is where do I go to meet you? Does that mean you're not here if I come to you, or can you come to me? I mean, if you're in me, do I? And he says this. I didn't read this part. Do I just have a part of you? But wherever you are, you're of one substance. Wherever you are is all of you. So do I have all of you in me? Of course not. How can this human and this divine meet at all? And so the questions are deeply related. And of course, as we transition into both perhaps the theological sorts of answers, and specifically the answers that even in the midst of this century literature tries to bring about, as we transition, it's important to remember, of course, the very word logocentrism, which is a different thing than I would say than capital, well, not capital Greek, but the logos, in arche, in halogos. In the beginning was the Word. And of course, those of us who have heard a bunch of sermons on John 1 and stuff, or have heard it unpacked, it doesn't just mean the Word, like printed or written or something. In the beginning was the Word, the logos, the argument, the idea, the conception, the representation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being by him. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Came into his own, those who, and goes on, all the way down to verse 14. We know this, And the Word, this is whatever, possibility. The Word existed before, I shouldn't even use the past tense. The Word exists before time. It's not contingent. The second person of the Godhead, The representation, and of course the word, re-present. The making present distally, via a different medium perhaps, was, existed before time. The Word, the logos, became sarx, became flesh, which is the exact same word that, of course, Paul would use in Romans 6 or whatever, like flesh wages war against the spirit, right? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so the paradox there is that in all other, instances that we're aware of, maybe save one, a representation or an image is a lesser iteration from the original, right? But in this case, if we affirm that, that Christ is fully God, fully man, it's not that he lacked something before he was incarnate, perhaps, but that somehow he is what he was always in its most fullest sense, both in being incarnate and, as it says in Revelation, he was slain from the foundation of the world, being killed and resurrected. But that image, the image of the invisible God, the exact representation of his nature, the radiance of his glory. Where I'm going is, here's an instance between the Father and the Son where representation doesn't result in infinite play. It doesn't result in ambiguity or something, while it still, while not being the same thing. Okay. Now, so moving on. Let's choose amongst my books. I know sometimes I kind of just get talking. I lose my place now. Yeah. Here we go. So the question, of course, is is there any way to overcome this subject-object dichotomy? And is there any echoes of potentially ways that we might, philosophically, as believing Christians perhaps, affirm? Is there any echoes of those ways within literature? Okay. So let's go to, here we go, back to The Sun Also Rises. First of all, a little something that I barely noticed the first time, but that begins to get at this. So Jake, the main character, is actually, it's kind of hidden throughout, but he is actually a Catholic, as he would call himself, a rotten Catholic, not very good, but he's somebody who does believe in God despite everything else that he feels. So let's look at a little vignette where he goes into a cathedral and tries to pray. At the end of the street, I saw the cathedral and walked up toward it. The first time I ever saw it, I thought the facade was ugly, but I liked it now. I went inside. It was dim and dark, and the pillars went high up, and there were people praying, and it smelt of incense, and there were some big, wonderful windows. I knelt and started to pray, and prayed for everybody I thought of, Brett and Mike and Bill and Robert Cohn and myself, and all the bullfighters, separately for the ones I liked, and lumping all the rest. Then I prayed for myself again, and while I was praying for myself, I found I was getting sleepy. So I prayed that the bullfights would be good, and that it would be a fine fiesta, and that we would get some fishing. I wondered if there was anything else I might pray for, and I thought I would like to have some money, so I prayed that I would make a lot of money. And then I started to think how I would make it, and thinking of making money reminded me of the Count, and I started wondering about where he was, and regretting I hadn't seen him since that night in Montmartre, and about something funny Brett had told me about him. And as all the time I was kneeling with my forehead on the wood in front of me and was thinking of myself as praying, I was a little ashamed and regretted that I was such a rotten Catholic, but realized there was nothing I could do about it, at least for a while, and maybe never, but that anyway it was a grand religion, and I only wished I felt religious, and maybe I would next time. And then I was out in the hot sun on the steps of the cathedral, and the forefingers and thumb of my right hand were still damp, and I felt them dry in the sun. The sunlight was hot and hard, and I crossed over beside some buildings and walked back along side streets to the hotel. Now, pretty quiet little passage. In the midst of it, for those of you who haven't read it, it takes place in the 20s, more or less, in France and Spain. Jake's an American who's there as a journalist, as Hemingway was. And they go to Pamplona and San Sebastian in Spain for the running of the bulls and the bullfights. And there's a huge fiesta because, of course, it's a holy week celebrating the arrival of the relics of the saint to the place. But it's this whole, holy week. Anyway, he goes into this church, and first thing you notice is it's dim and dark, meaning you can't see. And then he kneels down and he starts to pray. And, I'm sure we all pray like this. But he starts by praying for everybody, and it starts with Brett, the person he cares most about, and then others, and the bullfights, prays would be good for bullfights. Then he starts praying for money. He thinks, I could use more money. He prays he'd make a lot of money, and then he starts thinking about how to make money, and that made him think about this, and then by the end, he realizes this whole time he's been kneeling there with his forehead on the wood, thinking he's praying. He realized, what even is that? And he feels like a rotten Catholic, and out he goes. But then we hear, what happens after that? I know it's not like a class, but I need to take a break from talking, and you guys need to say something. So, what happens after that? He says, I only wished I felt religious, and maybe I would next time. And substitute whatever word you're most comfortable with, because I know 2019 potentially American Christians, that's the worst word. I wish I felt spiritual, or whatever. I wish I felt closer to God. Maybe I would next time. Call it what you will, because that's what he means, more or less. And then out he goes. But did you notice anything? Anything else? It goes right by. So let me go back there. I was a little ashamed, regretted that I was such a rotten Catholic, but realized there was nothing I could do about it, at least for a while. Wished I felt religious. And then I was out in the hot sun on the steps of the cathedral, and the forefingers and thumb of my right hand were still damp, and I felt them dry in the sun. Why are his fingers wet? Now, some people might think from this. Yeah, as he left, as one does, leaving a Catholic church, he dipped his hands in the water, the holy water that's the same water that's used for baptism, is blessed by the priest, with 3 fingers symbolizing the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and makes the sign of the cross, which is a prayer. He says, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Now, it could be a mindless thing, but the point is that is put directly in contrast to his mental, in his mind, attempts to reach to the spiritual that really are pretty feeble. not just his, I mean, I think all of ours. And that's contrasted with immediately he goes out and he does a physical prayer. He might still be, he's the same person, but he did not fail to carry out that prayer, because it's impossible to, unless somehow he was trying to subvert it. He literally did the thing, and it's a physical thing, that he couldn't grit out with his mind. So, of course, this is going to transition us into kind of talking briefly about sacrament, but the other thing to keep in mind is how this is a response to, well, let's just say to Cartesian dualism. Can I call in you again, Gil, or should I give you a break? Anyone else want to? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Get the mic passed.
Cartesian dualism is the idea that there's a spiritual component to people and there's a physical component to people. And Descartes spent a lot of time trying to figure out how those two things can interact, because how can a spiritual thing cause a physical thing to move, right? If I think about, I want my hand to move now, how is it that my hand moves when the thing my mind isn't the sort of thing that can push around physical things?
Exactly right. These, if you picture your mind as something more than your brain being just a computer that with wet circuits or something like that, when you take cognitive science, I forget what it's called, but like that's a going term in cognitive science. It's just like a wet computer, your brain. If you grant that there's any such thing as consciousness or spirit, well, I mean, are there ghosts that move chairs around? I mean, like, how do those two things interact? So Cartesian dualism, he definitely considered there to be a mind. René Descartes, of course, is the guy who came up with, what's his famous foundational statement? There you go. Cogito ergo sum. I don't actually speak Latin, so is it cogito? Oh. Cogito. That's perfect. Okay. And as a somewhat trivia aside, but so like, how do they connect? Where did he end up positing that perhaps there was the meeting between mind and body? You know everything. This is great.
He had this idea of occasionalism.
Okay, this is much lower than that. I just mean like what. You remember what body part he literally said? This is where they meet.
Oh, it's the spleen, isn't it? It's like some.
I think it might be Shakespeare. He might have said a lot of things. I just recall, and I think you'll find it if you look at this right here. What's there?
Oh, right. It's the pituitary, because you don't have to.
Right.
Anything else.
So like your brain's like, if this is in the late 1600s. Anyway, they're cutting apart cadavers and figuring stuff out about the human body. Look, you got two halves of everything else in your brain, but at the bottom there's just one pituitary gland. That must be where the spirit and the body, where soul meets body. And anyway, that's just an aside. But so from there we get what, if you hear something like, post-enlightenment, blah, 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 when people throw that around, well, what that generally means is this idea of, post-rationalism, or there's this mind and that's somehow above or separate from the body, and they're not connected. But then, of course, our John 1 would belie that. And what we're seeing in this passage in Hemingway is the beginnings of a picture of sacramentalism, namely that there are physical, non-referential, that's the important thing, channels of grace by which we might interact with God. Now, is that totally off the rails? Well, it matches our reality. As we said at the beginning, even amongst people who love each other, know each other very well, there is an infinite distance because we don't share the same mind. But, taking that a bit further, there's only a few ways that we can physically be completely associated with somebody. Obviously, in the act of sex, that's why it's such a cosmic, important thing even in Scripture, in Corinthians, why would Paul say, avoid immorality? Every other sin which a man commits is outside the body, but the immoral man sins against his own body. And 20th, 21st century Christians might say, so that's lesser? When in fact, that's not at all lesser. He's saying that's what you are. Do we exist without a body? Well, and then similarly, what's another way that's very similar, well, not very similar to that, but what's the only other way that you might become physically one with somebody? It's very bad in some instances, and perhaps very good in another instance. I brought the books on top. That'll be a hint. There you go. Thank you. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, you know what? That's a good point. That's maybe any other ones?
Blood transfusions.
Okay, that's good. Like what? We have dozens here. No, okay. Any others? I didn't think of those two. But that's not. I mean, that doesn't hurt anything of our concept here. But where am I going with this? If there is some degree to which words can't rise to the level of infinite meaning, which does not in any way take away, for example, from the truth of Scripture. If it's written in human languages, you could say it's perfect, and not say that it somehow puts into your mind the fullness of an infinite God. Those two things aren't contradictory, right? But if words don't do it all somehow, or if they're complementary to something else, well, what is that? Well, as Christ said, unless you eat of my body, you have no part in me. What? Yeah, just as the manna fell down from heaven, your fathers ate it. Well, feed us. This is after feeding the 5,000. Well, then they bring it up, right? They say, well, our fathers ate manna in the desert. And he's like, they ate that and died. I am the bread that fell down from heaven, right? And then, of course, the last thing that he says on earth, the last conversation, you could say, is this is the new covenant. In the same word as we have New Testament, which is not a series of propositional logic, propositions, something like that. So here's the new covenant. Here's my body. Here's my blood. No. Why do I go so far down that road? Well, because that's something that inherently you can do without understanding. It's a physical act by which, whether you think if it's a symbol, it's kind of hard to get around this. But either way, whatever degree of symbological nature of communion you ascribe to, still it's something you could kind of vaguely understand, but you can still do it and say, I did it, right? It's not all up in your head. And to the degree that you think mystically or otherwise, or not at all, but that you think that it's the actual body and blood of Christ, as he said, this is my body, and then you're mixing atoms with God. You're transfusing molecules as surely as if, as a husband and wife or an organ donor. And whether you think that's purely symbolic, at least it's saying something that the peasant woman in a medieval church who can't read and who can't understand very much is no further away from the possibility of intimate and actual meeting with God. And so that's not just an aside. Where I'm going is throughout the 20th century, and this is our last kind of chug, and then we'll just have you guys ask questions as you want. Throughout the 20th century, lots and lots of authors brought up this problem in literature, not philosophically. Prufrock, T.S. Eliot, that's where I was saying Eliot, yeah, that's right, that I was going to quote you. First of all, in the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he says, getting at this, would it have been worthwhile after all, if after all these things, between a man and a woman, if she should say, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant at all. And that gets repeated, that phrase, and it builds in a climax. Then finally he says, no, it wouldn't be worth it to be not just misunderstood, but fundamentally misunderstood. It wouldn't be worth it. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be, and goes on. There's this sort of impotence of the ability to meet mind to mind. But then the same author, after his conversion, about which he wrote the poem Ash Wednesday, which I was referring to, wrote this at the beginning of his 4 quartets, hinting at the need for something else. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. There's a thesis. If all time is eternally present, like if all we have is a moment before and after, and that's where the metaphysics of presence comes in. If all time is eternally present only, all time is unredeemable. Meaning, of course, in what way does something that happened 2,000 years ago, how does that get to me? Okay, by faith, but how does that event become present now? And I'll end the literature bit with some Flannery O'Connor. She said who's read The Violent Bear It Away? So it's another good one. So, Violent Bear It Away is a story that takes place in the South, and there's this fundamentalist preacher who dies at the beginning, and it's all flashback of this kid. The great uncle is the fundamentalist preacher. This kid who wants to just reject everything he's been told by his Christian great uncle, and so he goes off to town, goes off to his uncle, who's a psychologist, and lives in his mind. And Flannery O'Connor pictures him as he has eyeglasses and various artificial parts to kind of keep him going. He's made to seem to be all in his mind and not a full person. And the kid asks his uncle, why didn't he come back for me, first of all? Because the uncle had visited out in the woods. Why didn't he come back for me? And then, why didn't he bring the law out here and get me back? He had asked. You want to know why? His uncle had said. Well, I'll tell you why. I'll tell you exactly why. It was because he found you a heap of trouble. He wanted it all in his head. You can't change a child's pants in your head. And that's South for diaper, You can't change a kid's diaper in your head. All, right, Max? We've got five kids. All your philosophies, all your ideas about God, if they're only in your head, of course, don't enter into reality. And Flannery O'Connor was the one at this highfalutin literary meeting who, when this other popular author said to her, "Oh, I find going to church so aesthetically pleasing, and the Eucharist, it's so beautiful. I find it the most beautiful symbol, And this is in the midst of people whom Flannery O'Connor wasn't comfortable with, very cosmopolitan type people. And she, sitting there in her corner, said, "Well, if it's a symbol, then to hell with it." Now, I'm not trying to step on. Gutenberg is I think that's about as Protestant a name as one can have. But that's not where I'm going. Even Luther, remember what he wrote with his knife on the bar table? You know this? It's in Greek. He literally carved it with his knife into a table. It's probably about that good of handwriting when carved. Meaning is. And why did he do that? You think? What's your guess? I did not. Wait, no, come on. You took me right there. That was good. No, not Bill Clinton. It was Bill Clinton, right? Yeah. I did not. No. when Christ says, "This is my body." Again, and so in literature, and I'm going to just wrap up and you can ask questions if you want. In literature throughout the 20th century, you see a lot of images of, hey, this doesn't quite work, to try to effect transcendent meaning in the mind of my readers through words. And so somehow there's this attempt to put in either explicitly sacramental type images or things, for example, in Virginia Woolf, that aren't sacrament itself, but that resemble it, namely structures that make meaning without necessarily content being visible, so that we have the experience of being incarnated into the world of the story, being affected in certain ways without the meaning ever being said, pointing at the need for some sort of way around referentiality that I'd call sacramental. And I'm going to end with a little C.S. Lewis. Weight of glory. So, it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter. It's hardly possible to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. The load or weight or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it, and the backs of the proud will be broken. It is a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you would strongly be tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. All day long, we are, in some degree, helping each other to one or other of these destinations. It is in the light of these overwhelming possibilities, it is with the awe and the circumspection proper to them that we should conduct all our dealings with one another, all friendships, all loves, all play, all politics. There are no ordinary people. You've never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal, and their life to ours is as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. Immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. This does not mean that we are to be perpetually solemn. We must play, but our merriment must be of that kind, and it is in fact the merriest kind, which exists between people who have, from the outset, taken each other seriously. No flippancy, no superiority, no presumption. And our charity must be a real and costly love, with deep feeling for the sins in spite of which we love the sinner, no mere tolerance or indulgence, which parodies love as flippancy parodies merriment. And here's the last sentence of it, and what brings it back to full circle from logocentrism into this understanding that the fact that there is this subject-object dichotomy should interpersonally force us to realize, as Derrida called it, the infinite alterity of the other, and therefore charity. Next to, Lewis continues, next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. If he is your Christian neighbor, he is holy in almost the same way. For in him also Christ vere latitat truly resides. The glorifier and the glorified, glory himself, is truly hidden. So I'm going to open up for questions, because naturally with this kind of thing there's a lot of scattershot and I don't want to go over on time. So I'm going to end there, and then you can carry on with questions and we can chat about whatever part is most interesting.
I can start. James, thank you very much. That was that was wonderful and stimulating. I have a question about kind of the stakes of the problem. So, one of the things Christ has historically represented for Christians is the adequate expression or image of God, right? This one moment when the as it were, signified and signifier are, if not equal, at least adequate to each other in some sort of mysterious way. And obviously, so my first question is, did the post-structuralists like Derrida, they didn't allow for this, right? They didn't believe that this is, the incarnation is a metaphysics of presence par excellence, right? So, but even for Christians, the incarnation is one of a kind, right?
Yeah.
So, is the problem then how we, for lack of a better word, appropriate this? Because in a sense, even if Christ is an adequate expression of God, we are still removed from him by the same structures of language and the same kind of interpersonal barriers that you're talking about.
Right.
So is the question then how we achieve an adequate perception of the adequate image or representation of God that
Right.
Jesus represents?
No, great question. Two questions, really. And I didn't elaborate as much as I should have on the latter one. First one, though, to the post-structuralists, of course, they would have different answers to that. Since this is the example par excellence, as you say, of signification, that somehow it elides the problems, perhaps, of signification. It's interesting. Derrida says, just quote, on or about, and this is in an interview, on or about, quote, grace given by God, deconstruction as such has nothing to say or do. If it's given, this grace, if it's given, let's say, to someone in a way that is absolutely improbable, that is, exceeding any proof in a unique experience, then deconstruction has no lever on this. And it should not have any lever. Now, of the discourses which might be consequences of this grace, yes, deconstruction might have something to say or do while respecting the possibility of this grace. In relation to this experience of faith, deconstruction is totally useless and disarmed. Perhaps it is because deconstruction starts from the possibility of, if not grace, then certainly a secret, an absolutely secret experience which I would compare with what you call grace. Which is really interesting, and I won't go too far afield on it, but he's kind of getting at, there is something where we know that we know, but it's an absolutely secret experience, which of course is contradiction in terms. Because if it's absolutely secret, then you're not aware of it yourself, and then it's not an experience, even if it happened to you. But I do think that's where, to the second answer, no, I think that it's not merely, scripturally, it's not merely a greater perception in order to appropriate this incarnation. That's kind of where I'm going. That, theologically, I'd say that's what points to the absolute need of a sacramental system that, of course, historically for 20 centuries has been the case with the church. Namely that, not that there isn't meaning, or somehow it's not, we can't rely on the words, never, but that we're both mind and body. And that, as Peter says now, thus baptism now saves you. And we're like, whoa, baptism doesn't save you. That's at least, how I grew up. He says, well, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the appeal to God for a clean conscience, or whatever, that in 1 Peter said. Paraphrase, more or less. But what he's saying is, is there a difference between, if Jesus says, go, I don't know, go wash in this particular pool, is there any difference between whatever we consider faith to be that's not embodied and the doing of it? What if he did it with a bad attitude? Well, look at Naaman, with leprosy in the Old Testament, which is a perfect kind of presaging of baptism. What, aren't there a lot better rivers where I come from? Why in this muddy Jordan? And then the servants would say, hey, look, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, you would have done it. Why don't you just go do it? And he goes and he comes out washed completely new. The point is there any difference? And James, of course, the book, harps on this, but is there any difference between the action and belief? Where is that line? Because if you, as it says, if you believe you don't do it, then you don't believe. But can you do it without believing it? If the doing of it is somehow doing it faithfully or doing it with the intention to be healed, you can't do it, or you're not actually doing it without the belief. You're doing something that looks like, So that's what I'm saying, is that's why I don't think it's kind of a add-on. Like, otherwise it would seem weird, at least in the kind of fundamentalist Protestantism I grew up in. Why do we do this thing, the communion, once a month with this grape juice? Why grape juice? Well, it's because of Jack Welch in the 1800s and the temperance movement. He made a lot of money. There was no such thing as grape juice because it would go bad. There was always wine. Anyway, but does it matter? Mormons use water. Is there any importance to the physicality? So all that to say, no, I don't think it's merely a greater perception. There's all sorts of instances throughout Scripture about greater perception or appropriation of the knowledge that therefore leads to action. Paul is big on that, of course. Whether it's with one's neighbor, have this attitude in yourselves which is also in Christ Jesus, giving yourselves up. Be of one mind, united in one spirit, Philippians 2. But also, go into all the world and baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Jesus said that. Do this thing. Teaching them, too. And he goes on. Anyway, so I don't think it's just merely an appropriation. I think there is some mystical importance to the sacraments. And I don't think there is a good answer otherwise to this problem. Maybe many of us have had the experience of praying to receive Christ, and then did I mean it enough? And is it this thing, or and it almost becomes its own sacrament if I say these words in this way. Anyway, so I think that the authors in the 20th century are very aware of this problem. What else?
I have a question for you, with a comment, and that is, I'm with, I'm meeting with a group of people, and one of them has attended a church that has begun, has communion every time they get together. And before, she was at a church that did it very irregularly. And she said it has transformed her faith. And so I was thinking about what you said, or from that, from the Hemingway book.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting how Hemingway discusses the holy water on the hand, really tying together this element that we are both bodies and minds.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, this is the big question in Christianity, and how literature plays out or deals with this. I'm thinking of Green's work about coming to communion, and how he couldn't lie if he...
Yep, there we go.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of curious about that.
Well, so I'll just go with Graham Greene, since you brought it up, and it's such a great picture. And I knew I brought too many books because it's But as you brought up with the Hemingway quote, it's the mind and the body, and it's not even described when he does the thing. We don't even know. He doesn't say, then I did this. It's all described in the physical aftermath, right? Then I was out in the hot sun and I felt my thumb and 2 fingers drying. Described purely physically, as if to emphasize it happened despite how he felt crummy about his spirituality, trying to pray. With Graham Greene, with The Power and the Glory, who's read that one? Okay. There's a priest who's, to his own mind, the worst priest ever. He had, 5 minutes of indiscretion and is the father of a child. That's what he says, something like 5 minutes. And he's a complete alcoholic, but he is the only priest left in Mexico, basically, or at least in this region, because it's in the early 20th century, when, as surprising as it would be to imagine now, the church is completely outlawed. And so he's on the run in hiding, and he's going from place to place, and he shows up at the town, and people stand in line all night to go to confession. Not because, in Catholic theology, it's not like, you can't confess to God. No, it's utterly untrue, but it's an added physical grace to have a human being standing right there. And it's not dependent on the man, the priest. And so he says he is meditating during that time, because that's the night before, and they're going to do a mass in the morning before the people who are chasing him catch up to him. He says, "Here I am, basically the worst man ever, and yet I put God in men's mouths." And these illiterate and not very good peasants, receive God in their mouth. And so I do think it's essential to whatever Christianity is, that it's not all in our mind. I mean, that's why I'd say that, this idea that it is, it makes sense that the Reformation and the Enlightenment happen, in context with each other. But anyway, so these are explicitly, and I wanted to show those explicitly like sacramental images in the books. But, if you take, I'll just go to Virginia Woolf because it's on the last page, somebody that was definitely avowedly an atheist. So there's no okay, she's just trying to put her theology in the book, right? But she says, and this is actually so amazing, in her diaries, "I have some restless searcher in me. Why is there not a discovery in life? Something one can lay hands on and say, this is it. And shall I die before I find it? Then, as I was walking through Russell Square last night, I see the mountains in the sky, the great clouds, and the moon which has risen over Persia. I have a great and astonishing sense of something there, which is it." She has the quotes in there. "It is not exactly beauty that I mean. It is that the thing is in itself enough, satisfactory, achieved." The last page of To the Lighthouse, this painter in the book who kind of stands in for Virginia Woolf herself has been struggling to finish this canvas that nobody will see. Here's the last two or three sentences. "Quickly, as if she were recalled by something over there, she turned to her canvas. There it was, her picture. Yes, with all its greens and blues, its lines running up and across, its attempt at something. It would be hung in the attics, she thought. It would be destroyed. But what did that matter, she asked herself, taking up her brush again. She looked at the steps. This is kind of where she's painting. She looked at the steps. They were empty. She looked at her canvas. It was blurred from tears. With a sudden intensity, as if she saw it clear for a second, she drew a line there in the center. It was done. It was finished. Yes, she thought, laying down her brush in extreme fatigue, I have had my vision. And, the important thing there is that, she's drawing abstractly, similar to this, a portrait of Mrs. Ramsay, this person who's dead, who was sitting on those steps, But what finishes this thing is nothing of content. It's a purely structural piece. It's a syntax, or a syntactic bit. She draws one line in the middle. There. It's done. It's the thing in and of itself. So what I'm getting at is that, and she explicitly says it, she's looking for some way to get through what she calls the cotton wool, or the cotton balls, whatever, cotton wool, through that to whatever capital R reality is on the other side. And so she puts these sort of non-holy sacramental images in her book as ways that we somehow can get away or around logocentrism. So.
Thanks, James, for your talk. I had a question for you about kind of what you think is going on with Augustine. So I'm hearing what you're saying about kind of structuralism's critique of language in the sense that
Thanks, have a great night.
Because words exist to be used, there's no such thing as exhaustive usage. So I mean, as soon as you intend something different, the meaning changes as such. So the parallelism that I'm noticing maybe is that the quote that I heard you read from Augustine is addressing sort of his anxiety as something mid-30s new Christian as such, in trying to understand the concept of fullness as such. Would you be willing to comment a little bit on what you think his anxiety is about with respect to the fullness? Is that some kind of Neoplatonic residue? Is that a language issue that translates into English poorly? Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, so, and I was using that particularly to kind of just look at what he views as the impossibility of Like, what does it mean to be converted? Because, when later on in book 9 and 8 and 9, when he actually then makes the choice, he talks a lot about, hey, I'm totally convinced, but I'm not converted yet. What's the difference? Or like, even I totally understand it and I want to, but that doesn't mean it. What means it, And he actually makes an action. He professes before a church, and that's not the crucial moment with the voice that he hears when he makes a prayer and that kind of thing. But what I'm saying is that there's a lot of these paradoxes that it could just be, this abstract baloney that we kind of spend time on in our spare time. Or on the other hand, if you're ever like, what does it mean? God loves, does he interact with my life? Even like you're talking about the Cartesian dualism. Like, he's never written things in the sky. I've never even heard the voice, like Augustine, of take and read his child's voice. So this sort of like, what does belief mean? Like, God can't come to me. Why am I calling him? But he wants me to worship him, but I can't worship him until I know him. So the very human impossibility of conversion is what I think he's getting at, even from the beginning. But he's trying to tease out what it means to interact with God, I think, in the beginning. But it relates very much to, as he goes onward. And so, no, I don't think it's purely like trying to understand the form of like fullness, and that's the only thing definitely there. But just the very human difficulty of interacting with something infinite.
So you would not say that the concept of fullness is particularly significant to his problem for him?
I'm not an Augustine expert, so I wouldn't say anything with any surety on that.
I'm not implying that it is. I'm just curious.
So you're taking notes. So you would say this isn't. No, maybe it is.
I'm not one of these sort of audience members, so don't worry.
Like, okay,
No,
I've
I'm not a
set you up perfectly. Now let me give you my dissertation. Yeah.
But Charles Taylor uses that word fullness to talk about awareness of the transcendent.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, that's.
interesting whether he picked it up.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, I bring up the distinction because it seems like there's a parallelism between what Augustine is grappling with and what you're bringing up with respect to structuralism and Derrida's critique of it. And I'm forgetting the author, but I think it's Schaeffer. I think it's Francis Schaeffer, who I'm going to paraphrase, basically would make the argument that says you don't need to know exhaustively to know truly. And so fullness kind of leans in the exhaustive direction, at least as I'm understanding Augustine and Schaeffer to use those words. So it might be purely kind of a pedantic, semantic sort of question. But I was just curious if you had thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, Schaeffer is kind of a, whatchamacallit, apologist in a lot of ways, even though he wrote about culture and stuff. But that's really important to know, like, well, how much do you have to know before it's convincing or something, because otherwise, like, what does apologetics mean? But I think that's a different question, because practically we already know all that. That's where I'm kind of saying, it's like, we're not confused. Too much about when we actually talk. It's like, I don't feel like I'm in normal situations not understanding. But I think as we approach the ineffable, as we approach the divine, we do get more and more, or actually more practically, as we approach relationship. I mean, my wife and I have a perfect relationship, so we don't have this problem. But I've heard of people, No, in fact, we were just recommended this book called, this might be a good place to end, I want to let people go, called How to Improve Your Marriage Without Talking About It. And I should have started with an anecdote about that. But what does that mean? How could you do that without? Well, sometimes the closer you get to deeper meaning, the harder and harder it gets to talk about it. And I think that's what certainly 20th century authors from modernism on grappled with. Because they weren't just trying to communicate enough to get it or prove something. It's like, yeah, but you can always contradict that, the weight of evidence. How do we, in the wake of World War I, for example, and meaningless destruction of millions and millions of lives, how do we make sense of reality? And you say this about God, or we could transfer it to our own lives. I'm going through this, people suffer, and you think you understand mine because of that. No thanks for your words. So anyway, I think it's in those instances, more than just the weight of convincing evidence or something like Schaeffer might point to. Yeah, yeah. Hey, thanks. Thank you guys all so much for kind of bearing with everything, trying to get through this.